Hello everyone, my name is Apostolos Kokolis, and I will be presenting our work Cloak, Tolerating Non-Volatile Cache Read Latency. This work was done in collaboration with AMD Research. Data-intensive workloads such as high-performance computing applications and databases are very popular today, and they put increased pressure on the last-level caches. So researchers have examined other memory technologies for LLC, and these include embedded DRAM or non-volatile memories. Non-volatile memories have multiple advantages. Compared to SRAM, NVM has higher density and lower leakage power. It also offers non-volatility and greater immunity to soft errors. Moreover, it needs no refreshes or raw buffers like DRAM does. However, NVMs have some important limitations. Their access time is characterized by high latency for both read and write requests. Manufactured memories report 10 to 30 times higher latency for reads and 25 to 100 times higher latency for writes. Moreover, they have lower bandwidth because their access to the NVM data array is non-pipelined. And also, they have higher dynamic energy consumption for its access. This means that we need a low-cost solution to overcome the high latency problem of NVM. Prior work has tried to overcome the NVM's problems of higher latency, but primarily the write latency and not the read latency, and dynamic power, using solutions that span the device, circuit, and architecture levels. The solutions that are under the device and circuit level category mostly sacrifice non-volatility and retention time to make writes faster, or they adjust the transistor size. However, these solutions reduce the retention time, so they introduce refreshes, which increases the power consumption, and also increasing the transition size limits the capacity benefits of NVM. On the other hand, architecture-level solutions mostly combine SRAM and NVM memories together in a hybrid memory hierarchy. These solutions monitor accesses to the LLC and swap lines between the SRAM and the NVM portion of the cache. The problem is that it needs increased complexity and more area to monitor accesses, and also it increases the number of writes to NVM every time they swap cache lines between the SRAM and the NVM portion. The motivation of our work is that shared last-level caches have increased capacity pressure, and unfortunately, there is limited opportunity to increase the capacity of LLCs due to the area and power requirements of the underlying SRAM technology. So NVM is a viable alternative, but we need a low-cost architectural solution that does not sacrifice the capacity benefits of NVM, its reliability, and its non-volatility. The insight of our work is that we can exploit page-level data reuse at the last-level cache to hide the increased read latency of the NVM. Our work is called Cloak, and the main insight is that an L1 TLB miss for a page that was referenced before might be a good hint for future LLC hits. So to test this insight, we create the following experiment. We have a shared L3 with 16 megabyte cache that works as a victim cache. And then we run our benchmarks and we observe that an L1 TLB miss for a page that was referenced in the past is actually a good hint that some of the LLC resident cache lines will be reused again soon. And in our benchmark, we find that on average, 94.9% of all LLC hits are actually for pages that are being reused. Moreover, we saw that as the size of the LLC increases, the number of the LLC hits for reused pages also increases. This means that if we see a refill in the L1 TLB for a page that was used in the past, it's a good indicator that many of these cache lines that are still in the LLC will be reused again soon. The contribution of this work is Cloak, which uses the L1 data TLB misses to identify page reuse in the LLC. It adds small SRAM buffers, which we call page buffers, to the LLC to service anticipating requests. We alter the LLC data layout to facilitate the activation of these cache lines to the page buffers, and we create an adaptive replacement policy for selecting which page buffer will be used for activating the cast lines of a page. And overall, we improve performance by 23.8% and ED square by 39.9% compared to an SRAM LLC, or 8.9% and 17.5% compared to an NVM-only design. So let's take a closer look to Cloak overview. So Cloak is a hardware mechanism that takes advantage of certain L1 data TLB misses to exploit data reuse in large NVM LLC caches. And this is happening to hide the NVM's higher and non-pipeline read latency. In this graph, we saw with blue color all the hardware structures that Cloak needs to modify. But also, LLC is augmented with small SRAM buffers, which we call page buffers. And the page buffers have their own tags, and the buffer was going to hold the cast lines. The page buffers are some small SRAM-based cache structures which act as fast access buffers to the NVM LLC. And each one of these page buffers can hold a set of NVM resident cast lines for a given page. Then we modify the layout of the LLC so that cast lines from the same page are always in the same physical row of the cache. This helps us identify fast and the cast lines of a certain page and move them to a page buffer. The core operations of Cloak consist of data movement from the NVM to a page buffer when we receive a TLB signal about a page that was used before in the past, and also servicing LLC requests, read requests, either from the NVM data array or from the page buffers. So let's first see how an L1 TLB hint operation works. On an L1 TLB field, we have to check whether this page was used in the past or not. To identify whether the page was used before, we check whether this page was found in the L2 TLB, so we use it again sometime in the past, or the accessed or dirty bits of the PTE entry are set. If they are set, it means that sometime before we access this page and maybe we wrote to a cast line of this page. If this page was not used in the past, then we don't do anything. But if it was used in the past, then we send a hint to the L3 controller. Then the L3 memory controller needs to check whether this page is already activated in one of the page buffers. If it is already activated in one of the page buffers, then we take no further action. If it's not, then we have to check how many cast lines of this page are actually present in the LLC at this time. If the number of cast lines exceeds a programmable threshold, then we will activate these cast lines to a page buffer. If it's not, then we're going to do nothing. So in this case, the cast lines are not above the threshold, so we don't do anything. But if the population of the cast lines is above the threshold, then we search for an available page buffer, and then we transfer the cast lines from the LLC data array to the page buffer. On an LLC request operation, a read request reaches the last level cache. Then we have to check the SRAM tags of the LLC to identify whether it is a hit or a miss. If it misses in the LLC, we just send the request to main memory. However, if it hits in the LLC, we need to check whether it also hits in the page buffer or not. If it doesn't hit in the page buffer, then we service the request from the NVM data array per usual. But if it hits in the page buffer, then we service the request from the faster page buffers. Now, copying the cast lines of a page from the LLC to a page buffer requires finding all the NVM resident lines of that page. This means that we need to search the LLC and find all the cast lines of this page. But to avoid these massive LLC tag lookups and NVM cache read operations, we will change the data layout for the LLC. We want a layout that places the same page cache lines in the same physical row of the NVM. Imagine an example where we have a 64 megabyte cache slice. So each row of the LLC can hold 64 cache lines, and can be split into different sets and can have cast lines from different pages. The only requirement that we have is that all the cast lines of a certain page will map to the same physical row in the LLC. The address bits can be split into the page offset, which is the lower 12 bits, and the physical page number. The page offset bits change for each cast line within a certain page, but the physical page number bits always remain the same. So we want to only use the physical page number bits to index into the row of the LLC. So what we do is that we use the first 6 bits for cast line offset per usual, and then we can use bits 6 and 7 to index within the different sets of the LLC. But the next bits 8 to 11, are not going to be used for indexing. Instead, they're going to be part of the tag, and we call these bits tag low. Then we're going to use bits 12 to 24 from the physical page number to index into the row of the LLC. This means that every cast line of this page will map to exactly one row in the LLC. And then the rest of the bits 25 to 47, are going to be used for tag, and we call them the tag high. With this layout, we forced every cast line of a page to be in one single row of the LLC. And this reduces our search space when we're trying to figure out what's the popularity of cast lines for a given page in the LLC. The next important operation is to transfer cast lines from the NVM data array to the page buffers. The LLC may only contain a fraction of the lines of a given page. This means that having large page buffers might be inefficient. Hence, the page buffers can be sparsely populated if we don't have all the cast lines. In order to increase the utilization of our page buffers, we use page buffers that are smaller than a page. In our case, we select to use 2 kilobytes of page buffers. So imagine that we have a row in the cache that can have multiple cast lines of page A. We split this row into 2 regions, 2 kilobyte regions. And then we multiplex lines from these 2 kilobyte regions into the same page buffer. An important fact here is that given that the physical row is equal to a page, it's 4 kilobytes or 64 lines, steering data from a row to a page buffer can increase the design complexity of the page buffers. So what we do to simplify it is that each cast line from the LLC can go to exactly the same spot into the page buffer. So the activation of cast lines to the page buffer happens in 2 steps. In the first step, we move cast lines from the first region into the page buffer into exactly the same spot that they are in the 2 kilobyte region of the cache. And then we record the region of its cache line. So in this case, we recorded that these cache lines are activated from the first region. In the second step, we go to the next 2 kilobyte region of the LLC, and we activate the cache lines of page A that are present in the second region. And we record in the region bits where we found these cache lines. The only problem that can arise in this situation is that some lines might contest for a single spot of the page buffers. In our case, cache lines A1 and A3 both contest for the first spot of the page buffer. So we need to decide which cache line is going to be activated in the page buffer. To pick a line, we select to activate to the page buffer the line that is from the same half of the page as the address that triggered the page buffer activation. So if the address that triggered the page line activation is from the second half of the page, we're gonna favor cache lines that are also from the second half of the page. And we do that to take better advantage of spatial locality. So tag checking is the next operation that happens when we want to service a request from the LLC. We know that the LLC has its own sharp tag array in the NVM data array. And also to keep track of the pages and cache lines that are present in the page buffers, Cloak employs an array that we call the page buffer tags. The page buffer tags consist of multiple fields. They have the physical page number of the activated page in its page buffer. There is a replacement field that is a counter used for selecting the page buffers. There is a residency counter, which is a counter of the number of valid cast lines currently in the page buffer. And there is the region bits that we explained earlier, that they keep track whether this cast line was present in the first or second region of the LLC physical row. So when an LLC read request reaches the last level cast, we first check the SRAM tag array and the page buffer tags in parallel. The SRAM tag array needs to tell us whether this is a hit or a miss. If it is a miss, we just send this request to main memory. But if it is a hit, then we need to also check what is the region reported in the page buffers and what is the region reported in the SRAM tag array, in order to decide whether this is a page buffer hit or a page buffer miss. To find a page buffer hit, we need to first have this page activated in the page buffer, and also the region of the LLC physical row with the matching address is the same as the one indicated by the region bit of the corresponding location of the page buffer. If it is a page buffer hit, we're going to service this request from the page buffer. Otherwise, we're going to service this request from the NVM data array. This means that we can be servicing requests from the page buffer and the NVM data array in parallel. Or to put it differently, servicing requests from the page buffer does not block other requests that target the NVM data array. So this increases the parallelism that we have in the LLC. In order to find a page buffer to activate the cast lines of a page, we create a new replacement policy. So we created a new page buffer replacement policy that considers how many cast lines are resident in a page buffer, and what is the frequency of accesses to the page in the page buffer. And we're developing this new algorithm in order to capture the dynamic behavior of accesses to each page buffer. We don't want to either replace a page buffer too early before its entries are accessed, nor keep a page resident the page buffer it is not being accessed that often. So for that, we're going to be using the replacement residency counters from the page buffer tags. The replacement counter is calculated as the product of residency times activation period. Activation period is a programmable threshold that says how many cycles we need to keep this page buffer open for each cast line that is present in the page buffer. The replacement counter decreases every cycle and is recalculated on every page buffer access, always as the product of residency counter with the activation period. Once the replacement counter reaches 0, it means that the page buffer entry is subject to replacement. The residency counter keeps track of how many cast lines are currently present in this page buffer. On a page buffer read, it decreases by 1, and on its page buffer write, it increases by 1. To evaluate our design, we used CMIX full system simulator that we integrate with the SST cycle accurate simulator, and we modified the LLC latency for NVM and added the page buffer for Cloak. In our simulations, we used 3 nanoseconds latency for reads, which is 10 cycles more than SRAM, and 8 nanosecond latency for writes. However, we also have in the paper a sensitivity analysis that targets different latencies for NVM, and we also have a sensitivity analysis with different sizes of NVM. In this case, we have an NVM that is 4 times more dense than SRAM. And we compare 4 different configurations. We have a baseline configuration that is based on an SRAM LLC. We have an NVM-only configuration that is using STT-RAM for LLC, which is 4 times bigger than SRAM. We have Cloak, which also has STT-RAM for LLC and the page buffers that we described. And we have an optimistic scenario that we call OSRAM, which has an optimistic LLC with a density of an STT-RAM, but the latency of an SRAM. For our workloads, we have 10 different benchmarks from the SPEC CPU 2006 and SPEC CPU 2017 benchmark sheets, and 4 benchmarks from the Coral and Coral 2 benchmark sheets. First, we want to show you the efficiency of the page buffers. In order to achieve high performance, it is very important to maximize the use of the page buffers. This graph shows the percentage of the LLC hits serviced from the page buffers instead of the STT-RAM data array. And we find that 44% of all requests are being serviced from the page buffers instead of the LLC, the NVM data array. This means that on average, more than half of the requests hits in the page buffers instead of the data array. And especially for benchmarks with high L2 MPKI, like XS bench, that sees 57% of the LLC requests hitting in the page buffers, this leads to great performance improvement. Also, we see that most of the TLB hints that we receive from the L1 TLB are able to activate the cache lines in a page buffer. So most of the times we have a page buffer available to activate cache lines from a new page. Now, to isolate the performance impact of the page buffer, we want to compare the total time that a read request spends in the LLC, in the NVM-only case, and in Cloak. So we calculate this time as the total number of cycles from the time that an L2 miss is issued until the response is sent back to the L2, either by the LLC, in the case of a hit from the NVM data array or the page buffer, or until the LLC declares a miss. We do not count the number of cycles that spend in main memory. So what we see in this graph is that Cloak can greatly reduce the latency of reads in the LLC. On average, it's reduced by 42.5%. So because NVM-only design and Cloak have similar L3 MPKI, this decrease is mostly because of the page buffers. So the page buffers not only speed up Cloak by servicing requests faster than the NVM data array, but also they do not block the NVM data array. So while we're servicing a request from the page buffer, a different request can be serviced from the NVM data array. For our performance evaluation, we compare the 4 different designs, which is the baseline, the NVM-only, Cloak, and the optimistic SRAM design. All the results are normalized to the case of the baseline configuration. And what we see here is that Cloak is 23.8% faster than SRAM, while NVM-only is 14.9% faster than baseline, and optimistic SRAM is 27.9% faster. We see that even NVM-only design is faster than baseline, and this is because the LLC capacity increases, so we have many more hits in the LLC instead of main memory. Also, the L2 miss response time decreases by 30.5% for Cloak and by 15.9% for the NVM-only compared to baseline. Cloak is able to further decrease the L2 miss response time because not only it's bigger, so it has more hits in the LLC, but also has the page buffers that are servicing requests much faster than the NVM data array. To compare the energy evaluation, we have again the same 4 configurations: baseline, NVM-only, Cloak, and optimistic SRAM. And we see that Cloak reduces ED squared by 39.9% compared to baseline, while NVM-only reduces it by 22.4% and optimistic SRAM by 43.3%. So we see here that Cloak is very, very close to that of an optimistic SRAM design. However, Cloak consumes more dynamic energy in the LLC. It needs more energy because it performs more tag checks. It checks both the LLC tags and the page buffer tags. and and we have to read from the NVM data array to activate cast lines in the page buffers. However, it is able to compensate this extra energy by executing much faster. To characterize the page buffers, the left graph shows the percentage of cast lines promoted into page buffers that are actually accessed from the page buffers. We will group the benchmarks into 3 different groups. Group A has spec CPU 2017, B has spec CPU 2006, and Group C has the Coral benchmarks. We see in this graph that on average, 51.1% of the promoted cast lines are referenced by the benchmarks that we used. This hit ratio is helped by our page buffer replacement algorithm that favors the victimization of page buffers with fewer lines, and also that we do not pollute the L2 cast, so we don't have many writes coming back to the LLC. On the right side, we saw a graph with the percentage of LLC resident cast lines of a page that are promoted in a page buffer when a hint is received from the L1 data TLB. This number is not always 100% because we saw earlier that some cast lines might contest for the same spot in a page buffer, and also we might receive a hint for a page that doesn't have a population great enough of cast lines to the LLC to be activated in a page buffer. On average, 68.8% of the lines that are present in the LLC are being promoted to a page buffer across all our benchmarks. We also performed 2 sensitivity analyses. One sensitivity analysis with different LLC size. We have 4 megabytes, 8 megabytes, 16 megabytes, and 32 megabytes. And we have 3 different configurations: NVM-Only, Cloak, and optimistic SRAM. All the results are normalized to the case of baseline SRAM with 4 megabytes memory. And we see that Cloak always achieves higher performance than NVM-Only, and that even for 4 megabytes, Cloak achieves the same performance as that of baseline. We also perform a sensitivity analysis with different latencies. We have 3 nanosecond read latency, which is the same as the one we used so far, 6 nanosecond latency for reads, and 9 nanosecond latency. And we see that Cloak is able to tolerate the higher read latency, especially when compared to NVM-Only, that for 9 nanoseconds is slower than the baseline, even though it has much higher capacity. And also, Cloak is always faster than baseline. This means that Cloak is able to make NVM a viable alternative for LLC, even if the read latency of NVM is much higher than the one we used so far, even if it goes from 3 nanoseconds to 9 nanoseconds. In the paper, we have more details about Cloak. You can find details about the area and energy evaluation of the Cloak's hardware structures. We have more implementation details, and we saw how we handle huge pages. And we also have more evaluation results. We have more performance evaluation. We compare against an alternative prefetch design, and we have a breakdown of the whole energy evaluation. In conclusion, Cloak uses L1 TLB misses to predict page reuse in the LLC ahead of time. It changes the LLC layout to facilitate the use of the page buffer and the activation of same page cast lines to one of the page buffers. And overall, it improves performance by 23.8% and ED squared by 39.9% compared to an SRAM LLC, and by 8.9% and 17.5% compared to an NVM-only design. With that, I want to thank you for seeing my presentation and looking forward to see you in the main conference. Thank you.